Thank you very much, Lars. So this remote clicker has a button that I have been told not to touch, so we'll see how that goes. Because your fingers kind of just go to where you expect it to be. So let's see, that one works. All right, cool. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I really, really like talking at community events. There's a different vibe to a community organised event, and this one is rather fabulous. We had a rather lovely speakers dinner last night, and the organisation that goes into one of these events is just extraordinary. And this one is extremely slick. I've spoken actually a lot of commercial events that don't go as smoothly as this one has, so kudos to the organisers. One reason I really sort of want to talk to data engineers and about the fact that, everyone's talking about AI these days. The definition of AI has expanded enormously over the past sort of year. It shifts and changes. I think pretty much now it just means anything clever that anyone does with data. But what hasn't changed is that if you try to do anything, smart AI included, on top of crappy data, you get crappy stuff out the other end. I've been working in and around data for all of my commercial career. And before my commercial career, I was an experimental physicist, so that's everything to do with data as well. And I've seen an enormous amount of definitional change. I've seen an enormous amount of broadening of the space. And unfortunately, as Joe was saying, I've seen a lot of a move away from the idea that you need to understand your data well in order to build on top of it. For the past 7 years, I've been building AI-powered products. So that means building and launching and running and maintaining, which is a lot of work as well, AI inside products into market. And I'm delighted to be in that space. I have an amazing time. I really, really love it. But you can never let go of where your data is coming from. And all of those years doing those things, and years before that, I did actually used to run an enterprise data team at CommBank back in the day, when I really did go and read every single book about data modeling that was around at the time, including the Kimball and the Inman ones. All those things have taught me that there's an enormous amount of miscommunication between all the different people who are involved in building these products. And that sort of range of people has expanded enormously over the time that I've been working in this space. And all of that miscommunication just adds an enormous amount of friction. So none of the products that we build with data are easy. The products that we build with AI are very, very far from easy. And when you put miscommunication between the really broad spectrum of folks who need to be involved in building them, it just stops you from getting there and building the great things. So this is not a talk about about tools or stacks or anything like that. It's a talk about the people who build products and sort of just trying to be curious about those people and step back and expand our understanding about what different folk that you might interact with in your job as a data engineer or a data modeler or an analytics engineer, what all the people that you're talking with don't know. Because I sit across a really large team and I see sort of so much miscommunication and people talking past each other. And I believe that now more than ever, and that's a really trite thing to say, but I really do think it's true, that it's critical that both the builders and the users of AI, and let's be frank, pretty much all of us are now users of AI because there's an enormous amount of AI products being built into the fabric of consumer tools that we use every day. It's really, really important and becoming more important every day that we have a practical understanding of how the data that flows through our world is used, how it impacts us, and what we can do when things go wrong. So today, that's about folk like yourselves who are literate. But for me, and many other times when I'm speaking and writing, it's about folk who actually don't really know the stuff very well at all. I love speaking at events like this. I also spend a bunch of my weekends and sort of evening time just trying to make some of this stuff explicable for folk. So if you're intrigued by what I talk about today, you can follow me on LinkedIn, where I do post relatively regularly. And I also do, like Joe, have a Substack, Data Runs Deep. So AI can be quite staggeringly useful. I certainly personally do not want to go back to reading paper maps, partly because I get really badly car sick. And I would really, really find it annoying if type ahead vanished. I'd have to learn to spell again. But unfortunately, AI can also have really, really awful consequences. And, all of those here in Australia will be unfortunately acutely aware of the robo-debt crisis, which was, as I said, the definition of AI has expanded. You can very definitely say that was an absolute failure of an AI enterprise that had devastating results on a lot of people. Now, sometimes those horror stories, and they do occur, happen because somebody got it wrong, they chose the wrong algorithm, the algorithm wasn't applied properly, using the wrong science. But actually, although those kinds of errors do happen, trust me, they definitely do, they're usually flushed out during experimentation and training. So it's easy to choose the wrong AI model algorithm. It's easy to do it. It's hard to get all the way to the end of a functioning, useful product and still have made that mistake. So does that mistake happen? Absolutely. Is that what causes the massive, nasty public meltdowns that end in, financial ruin and suicide? No, I don't think it usually is, because usually you can't get to the point of launching a product with that kind of problem still in it. So most of those big, messy public screw-ups and the insidiously poor sort of eroding results, like when some of the big financial providers launched some of their products and it turned out that they were biased against women and they were biased against people of colour, those sorts of insidiously difficult things that folk don't pick up pre-launch, they're almost always caused by problems deep down in the data, incorrect and unchallenged assumptions that people make about that data and what is and isn't in it. So I don't think this is going to be a big surprise to anyone who's in the audience. You're probably nodding along going, yeah, that's true, and it's really annoying. So if we know this, then why on earth doesn't it stop happening? Unfortunately, I think this is a big part of it. There is an enormous speed to market bias, and it's probably at its fastest right now. Everybody wants to roll out a generative AI version of whatever their product is, and people are just hell for leather and want to get it out the door. It's a time, unfortunately, when ethics and responsible use of AI do tend to get shoved rather sideways, and so do fundamental things like data quality. It's definitely also true that even with the most responsible, forward-thinking, tell it backwards, think about the consequences before you start team, data drifts over time. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So some of the insidious challenges, the teams did their very gosh darn best, and you still ended up with a challenge that actually met weeks or months or sometimes years after you launched it. The data has just drifted to a point where it begins to do things that are sort of unconscionable and biased. There's edge cases, of course there are. In any messy data set, you're going to have undiscovered edge cases. But what I'm keen to talk about today is when it's due to underinformed humans. So I mentioned at the start, this is, if you think about AI inside products, so products touching customers that are powered somewhere in the value chain of what they do using algorithms that have learned patterns from data. It's a breathtakingly complex system. And because of speed to market bias, the vast majority of the systems that are out there, no single person end to end understands the entire system. So the rule of garbage in, garbage out, which we all learned really early in our careers, certainly hasn't changed. Because everything that is in your data is, of course, ending up represented in that model of the world that is learned in the algorithm, and therefore it ends up affecting the behavior of your AI powered product. So it's this last point of the other ones exist. Absolutely they do. Good luck with you with stopping speed to market bias right at the moment. All power to your elbow. You can work harder on figuring out what the data drifts are. You can do good monitoring of your products once they're in market. But what I want to talk about today, because I think it gets talked about a little less, and it's in the power of all of us to make a small change every day, is underinformed humans. So it's ironic that machine translation offers translation between so many languages, and I've personally found this incredibly valuable when I was traveling in Japan, and you just hold it up and figure out what the someone was saying. It can't do what we really need it to do, and that is bridge a gap in vocabularies. Because if you are just getting a literal machine translation of the thing that you just said, it's just going to tell you what you said in a different language. Unfortunately, it's not going to help you more clearly state what you were trying to say, and it's not going to help you understand the gap in understanding at the ear of your listener. I've been in this game a long time, and I've worked across a really broad spectrum of what it takes to build an AI product. Certainly don't know everything, but I know enough to know when I don't know enough, and that's unfortunately still kind of an uncommon thing. So it frustrates me immensely when I see lack of awareness of lack of knowledge. Now, this can actually come in two different flavors, and I think it's kind of important to figure out that they're subtly different. The first one, our type 1 error, if you like, is when you don't realize that you have a knowledge gap. I imagine most of you, if you've been working, if you worked in this area, you're keen to keep working in this area, you're probably pretty much a lifetime learner. You can't really work in and around data engineering and not be a lifetime learner. So I'm willing to bet that you're reasonably prepared to work on your own knowledge gaps. Perhaps some of the things I can say in the next 20 minutes are going to just go, oh, I didn't realize I had that knowledge gap, and then, give you that curiosity to go and figure some of those things out for yourself. The other one, the sort of type 2 error, if you like, is when you don't realize that those people around you have a knowledge gap. And that's what I see a lot, playing out pretty much every day when folk are building these really complex products, is when you're using vocabulary that makes perfect sense to you, and it doesn't make sense to the person you're speaking with because of a really different background that they have, or when you're simply using words that they think that they know what you mean, but in actual fact, because of their different background and the different work that they do, they actually are thinking about something completely different. And why is this a particular problem, I believe, in the beautifully complex and interesting world of AI product builds? It's because there is an extraordinarily wide range of people who need to be involved in making those products successful. So I have certainly lived and worked in areas where all of these people need to be involved in the conversation at some point of the design, of the iteration, of the rollout, of the costing, of an AI product going into market. And it is an extraordinarily broad bunch of people, right? It's really obvious when you look at it like that there are going to be vocabulary gaps. I'm absolutely confident that all of you are not, you're like, yep, there's going to be a vocabulary gap between the board members of my company and the machine learning engineers. Where I think it's harder to spot is when you get down to the point that actually there's vocabulary gaps between even the ones who are super adjacent to each other. So enough of me prophetalizing that there are vocab gaps. I'm going to assume that at this point you've either all started doom scrolling or you agree with me, and so we'll take a little bit of a deeper look. So why do I care? I care because a knowledge gap and the vocabulary barrier that comes along with that is going to make for brittle products, and it's going to make for annoyed and frustrated colleagues. So what can you personally do? So I think the biggest changes that I see when folk really lean into this and really go, okay, Kendra, you've browbeaten me or convinced me or whatever into believing that these vocabulary gaps exist. What can I do? One is that they become familiar of where the knowledge gaps are. So one, endless conversation I've had over the last 7 or 8 years is between software engineers and software engineers who are moving into the space of building AI products, and call them what you like. It's a very misused term now. Data scientists, applied scientists, the folk with the algorithmic knowledge who are building the sort of crafting the scientific side of an AI product. Those folk have a knowledge gap because the software engineers have their own understanding and ideas about what algorithms are. For those of you who are trained classically in computer science, there are algorithms in computer science. They're not actually particularly closely related to the algorithms that most people are using in AI today. So become familiar where the knowledge gaps are, perhaps of the 3 adjacent groups around you, and then strive to fill those knowledge gaps while staying really, really, really aware of the vocabulary barrier that goes between you. So one thing I've often found useful in just sort of quantifying in your head what you mean is seek to be understood when you speak, and understand that being understood when you speak is not the words coming out of your mouth, which I did like to think it was 15 or so years ago, but it's how it's heard at the ears of the listener. So you can be as right as you like, but if I can't understand what you're saying because I have a fundamental gap in my knowledge about what you're talking about, we're not getting very far, and you might as well stop talking. So in the next, what have we got? We've got about 20 minutes. I can't hope to fill in all the gaps. I can't help to even uncover all of them. But what I was hoping we would do together was just sort of go through some of the example knowledge gaps that I've come across in the last few years. And all I can hope is to sort of spark your curiosity and go, oh, yeah, right. Maybe that's why that person kind of looked at me blankly when I said that the other day. And then just spark your curiosity to go hunting some of those knowledge gaps by yourselves. So, this is knowledge gap number one, or challenge between two adjacent groups of folk who work together really closely. Data models are not AI models. I know that sounds incredibly trite and it seems really obvious, but it's not. The word model, it's just there's a finite number of words in the English language, and it's perfectly fair enough that we all go and grab the word that makes the use, kind of, it's good sense, and then we just use it in our space. But I constantly see groups of people not understanding that one of them is talking about a data model, as Joe was just discussing for us, which I agree with him, are sadly lacking in many SaaS organizations today, an algorithmic model, or any of the other many kinds of models that you might come across in a company. So it's critical that folk are comfy to say, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, or, could you explain that more for me? People often aren't. So what you can do as the speaker is sort of walk that fine line between not wishing to make the person feel like they're stupid or they don't know what you're talking about, but just use a few more qualifying words. I think that's what I often do, is I just try to use a few more qualifying words. And I'm really comfortable saying, those words can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Could we just, at the beginning of our conversation, figure out that what I mean when I say this is the same thing as what you mean when you say this? This is another one sort of right at the other side of AI model building. I have come across a lot of people, particularly as you move further away from the data and the technology and into the product space and the executive and board space, who are aware that a machine learning model can be biased, and they just ask the science team to just take the bias out, right? And I think this is a place where you, as someone who works closer to the data, you'll have an innate sense already, oh, I don't think that sounds very feasible. What I'm suggesting to you, though, is that everyone is smart enough to understand that it's not feasible, but some people simply haven't stopped and thought about it. As somebody who works in and around data every day, you're soaking in it. If there are any Kiwis who remember that Palmolive ad from a long time ago, you're soaking in it every day. You viscerally get to live it. And so you understand that it's kind of, I used to say to some folk when I was back at Seek, I'd say, because it's obviously really important to take bias out of models that might match humans with jobs, because that is an extremely biased process in the human world. And so if you're building an algorithm to do that instead, ideally you would like it not to be a biased algorithm. And I used to discuss with my colleagues in product, if you'd like me to remove the bias from the algorithm, which obviously I would love to do too, first show me a fair world. And that's just, I think it's a little bit provocative, but it's a kind of a useful way. You can say, okay, cool. Bias compared to what is effectively the answer. It's effectively the question. Are machine learning models biased? Absolutely they are. Why? Because the bias is built into the data that we use to train them on. So I know that sounds really obvious, and it is. As soon as someone says it to you, says, hey, you know what, we capture the data out there in the world. It reflects the way the world is looking and the humans that created the data that we captured. The algorithm is not smart. We simply trained it to recognize patterns in that data. So all of the bias that is captured in the data from the world is going to end up in your model. If you're prepared to sit down and explain to someone, that takes you, 2 minutes? They will then understand it. They won't like it. So it's not going to take away the problems that your board would still like you to remove the bias in your machine learning models, but at least you won't be in the situation where they simply walk away from a conversation going, that person was obstinate, wasn't really listening, didn't seem to understand the business need to have an unbiased model in market. This is an interesting one, and one that I see both a lot of technical teams trip up on and a lot of financial calculations trip up on. So what I mean by financial calculations, AI products aren't cheap to run. So it wasn't that long ago that we were like, storage, cheapest chips, compute, no dramas, chuck it all in there, just give it a crack. And of course, the amount of data massively increased since then, and the amount of things you can do with that data massively increased. GPUs are not cheap. And low utilization usage of GPUs is really not cheap. So it is becoming really important that people really understand that training and scoring of models. Now, I'm guessing there's a lot of folk in the room who've had at some point in their career worked in and around data warehousing. There is a reason that we have OLTP and OLAP. They are really fundamentally important, and you do not want to attempt to run queries, analytical queries, on a database that's designed for operational work, right? That's why your dev teams don't let you get near the operational databases, because you bring them down with one analytical query. It's equally as true when you are training AI models. And I think a lot of folk miss the fact that no, you almost certainly can't efficiently train an AI model off a data store that is designed for BI. And you definitely, I'm sure there's going to be an edge case that someone's going to find and point out to me, so let me back off from that a little bit. There's almost certainly not going to be a situation where you have a data store that is designed correctly and efficiently to make for cost-effective training of your model, and that you can simply take that data store and the data model and stick it and use it for inference. So there again, I think, is something that a lot of teams just miss because they haven't really thought about it. They're like, oh yeah, cool, you need data, I'll give you data. The data's over there. And there's an enormous amount of work for that. It then goes into saying, well, we need to structure that data in a way that we can efficiently, with high utilization, fine-tune our LLMs, whatever it is, on the very expensive GPU that you hope you'll be able to get off your cloud service provider. And then again, you're going to need to have data structured in a similarly efficient for computation way in order to use it in inference. So even just down at the level of gizzer data and stick it in a store, you probably have to structure it in about 3 or 4 different ways. And again, adjacent teams are not necessarily going to understand that. Your software engineering devs who capture the data from the UI for the customer are very unlikely at the beginning to understand why you would have to restructure and restore the data before you begin. They're really smart people. That's one reason why I love working in and around data, is inherently you have to be pretty smart to be in this game. So folk can understand. I don't think it's ever sensible to assume that they're not understanding because they're unable to. It's just usually that they haven't thought about it. This is another one that, again, as soon as you explain it to people, no problem. But you would be shocked by how often this problem exists because people haven't examined their own assumptions. So I'll spell it out really clearly here, and you can spell it out really clearly when you talk to folk around you. No AI model can give you a guarantee of 100% accuracy. BI can give you certainty. That's kind of the point of BI, right? AI cannot. And if anyone says to you that they need an AI model that approaches certainty, you can say to them, I can't build you that. So let's not even bother to get started. So it's just a really good conversation to have with folk towards the beginning of a conversation around building that kind of a product. Hey, you are aware that anything built on data cannot give you a guarantee of 100% accuracy, because you'll find a lot of business problems dissolve when you politely point out the obvious, but something that someone might not have yet quite as sort of processed in their own head. Oh, okay, so this process where it actually is important to have 100% accuracy, either we should not invest company time, resource, and effort in trying to build an AI process that replaces it because it's impossible, or when we are doing that, we should absolutely make sure that we have either a human in the loop situation or a machine in the loop situation, so that all the best that the machine is likely to be able to do is prompt or help the human to make the right decision. I think the other sort of slightly overlooked niggle in here that I unfortunately see folk kind of falling over at the last hurdle. Oh yeah, cool, I get it, I understand. I get it, it's not 100% accurate. We'll get it up to human accuracy, right? Which is, again, the level at which 3 or 4 different humans would agree. It's not the same as one human, believing that they're accurate. Cool, that's cool, get it up to that, 90%, awesome, that'll do. Make sure that you really do sit down and think through, though, that if you are building something that is 90% accurate, 95% accurate, and that's a really good accuracy, that means that 5 to 8% of the time it's going to be wrong. And one thing that I've seen both in data teams who are more used to building exactly correct BI workflows, and with software engineering teams who are more used to building 100% deterministic, capture the data, do this thing with it, stick it in the database, pull it back out, give it back to the customer. When your workflow can't expect 100% accuracy, your workflow has to accommodate that. So it's a time when you want to go and be really aware of that fact and then think through, okay, so what will that mean? Is there a place where I have to be careful about how I take and persist the answer of this? Is there, for instance, and I've seen so many teams forget this, unfortunately, is it important for me to collect when the machine was wrong and store the fact that the machine was wrong so that we have the opportunity to understand where and why it gets it wrong? So that's another one that I've just seen so many adjacent groups trip up over, because the ML team, the scientists, they're like, why would I even bother to remind someone of that? That is so obvious to me. And the teams who are incented and driven to build 100% correct deterministic software systems that have very low latency and never go down and have really graceful failover, they've come from 2 quite different paradigms. They're both smart enough to understand the other paradigm, but you need perhaps to wake them up and suggest to them that there's this wrinkle that they haven't thought of. Sorry, I was checking how we're going for time. So history is critical to machine learning. This is one I see a lot of challenge with dev teams who are really, really good at capturing data, storing it in the operational database, and overwriting what was there before. So this is where folks who have a background in warehousing already have an innate understanding. We heard slowly changing dimensions come up in the previous talk. You have an innate understanding that you want to know the history. You want to know what happened before. A lot of your pure application software engineering colleagues won't be so aware of that. So it's just another one that is really useful to bring up, because my goodness, so many times have I gone to a database and discovered, yes, we overwrite. Not too surprising that we overwrite, but we don't even keep a last updated date on every field. This is kind of an interesting one. I think a lot of people miss, is that ML models, AI models, call them what you will, they're very tightly coupled to the specific task on which they are trained. So that's another one that I see folk just sort of being a little unaware of. Is, I'll give you an example from when I worked at Seek. We trained a model I was very proud of back then. It was a wee while ago. I don't know if it still runs. A model that was really good at taking CVs and taking job ads and saying, of the people who have applied for this job, these are the ones that I suggest you read the resume first because they seem like the best suited. And I tell you, when you're getting 800 or 2,000 applications for a single job, that's a very useful tool. It worked really well. You could not pick it up and apply it to the seemingly adjacent problem, which is, I have a job ad, I have many resumes of those passive candidates. Who are the top candidates? Those problems seem extremely similar. They are actually not. And that is really, really common when you're building AI products. So, where does that leave us? In my opinion, it leaves us with round out your own gaps. So, I don't mean to seek to be an expert everywhere. I just mean be really, really curious and be always striving to become aware of when you need to lean on others and go over and say, you know what, you understand this really well. Could you at least, give me some pointers as to where I might increase my understanding enough to not be tripping over and making mistakes? The other one I spoke about before, if I've convinced you that this is worth caring about, have a think about your communication style and speak to be understood. So if you're not speaking to be understood by the folks you're talking to when you're building products together, there is a reasonable question to be asked as to why are you speaking? And there is rather a beautiful flowchart that helps you remind yourself about that, which I'm very fond of. And then the other one I'd say is borrow with pride. So one thing you probably don't have time to do is to teach every single person in your space everything that you think they need to know. And hey, you may not be a person who finds writing really easy to understand things easy. And you may just also be extremely busy. So I would suggest be a really avid reader of introductory and explanatory articles. I find it really interesting when folk just go, I know that shit, I don't need to read it. Cool, you know it. But if you don't like writing and you don't particularly like explaining things to people, if you can find really excellent, well-written, well-crafted introduction articles to an area that you are super familiar with, keep them, stick them in a notes file or something, or your back pocket somewhere, and the next time you detect one of those knowledge gaps, you're like, oh, right, this person has no idea what a slowly changing dimension is, and it's going to be really important for them to know that. Instead of trying to explain it yourself and getting frustrated, just go grab that intro article and suggest to them that they might love to read it. Now, seriously, people are going to love you if you do that. I've been doing it for a really, really long time, just keeping a really good index of, hey, if you want to know where to get started, read this, and folk find it incredibly helpful. That is it. Thank you very much for listening. I am super keen to take questions. We have, only 5 minutes before morning tea.
Who's first?
But I'll be around afterwards.
I got any hands? You can be first. Oh, you can clap too. All right, we do clapping.